Good afternoon. Today we're joined live from rural Kenya by Jusper Machogu, who's a farmer and an agricultural engineer. For extra authenticity, he's organised his chickens to be chirping away in the background, and he's speaking from his farm in the village of Kisii. Now, his pinned tweet reads as follows on Twitter. Good morning from Kisii, Kenya. What is it like to live here without fossil fuels? Some refer to it as sustainable. I agree. Only if its definition changes to break your back if you want to eat, even though you'll be poor forever. And there's a video of Jusper weeding his maize crop by hand. And indeed, it does look like back-breaking work. This is obviously takes us to areas of huge interest the world over, and the drive for sustainable agriculture. And this is a wonderful opportunity to actually speak to someone who is living that sustainable dream, but sees its limitations, its shortfalls, and wishes to choose a different way forward. Jusper, welcome. How are you today?
I'm all good. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. If we could start with a little bit of your personal background. You're speaking out on matters relating to climate and agriculture and farming. Could you take us through your background in these areas and how you came to hold the views that you do at present?
Okay, so I'm Jusper Machogu from Kisii, Kenya. I'm an agricultural engineer. I hold a bachelor's degree in agricultural engineering from Egerton University, one of the biggest universities in Kenya in agriculture. I'm also a pro-fossil fuel advocate in Africa, as well as a farmer. Like, I'm preaching what I'm doing. Currently in Kisii, most people depend on their muscle power. So you have to eat so that your muscle has got energy, so that you can do work, various tasks around the farm. So back in university, actually, because I graduated in 2018 December. Before that, I was a Greenpeace member. Even immediately after that. So I was a Greenpeace member and another group called Let's Do It Kenya. The two are environmental conservation organizations. So we used to organize, we were a group of young people who cared about the environment so much. And personally, I felt so much bitter because when I looked at the environment and what we were doing to it, especially when it came to plastics, I felt really bad. So I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to be the change. So in one of the events after university, I think it dawned on me that I had some questions because I realized that in the slums, that's where we found more plastics and more litter. People didn't care much about the environment because they had far bigger problems. So upon sitting down and I wanted to be a stronger Greenpeace member, I wanted to be very active. I wanted to, so in the process, I went looking for what Greenpeace was all about, and I realized that Greenpeace was co-founded by one fella called Dr. Patrick Moore, and he was no longer a Greenpeace member, and that caught me off guard. I was so surprised. Why would you found such a big group that cared about the environment and then leave? So upon researching further, I came to the realization that Dr. Patrick Moore had a book out by the title Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, a book that I read. And after that, I realized I knew so little about the environment, about climate change, about plastics, about fossil fuels. And since then, immediately after that, I came across a guy called Alex Epstein. And since 2020, since the Corona period, it has been a mind-changing and learning journey. So here I am, a pro fossil fuel advocate in Africa.
I'd like to dive deeper into all of those aspects, but just before I do, I wanted to set the scene with a wee bit of what your environment's like where you are and what your life is like. For our audience, I was just looking at a few comparisons between Kenya and Britain. Population in Britain 67 million, population in Kenya 54 million. Poverty percentage in Britain 0.5%, poverty percentage in Kenya 29.4%. And we've got GDP, Britain 3 trillion, Kenya 113 billion. We've got GDP per capita, per head of population. In Britain, $54,000. In Kenya, $2,000. And we've got CO2 emissions, metric tons per person. Britain 4.6, Kenya 0.4. So that just sets the scene. So, but the raw figures don't really tell us very much. Could you tell us a little about your immediate environment and what life is like there?
So over here, I know mostly because what the people in the West see mostly, what they shown by mainstream media is people starving in Africa, deserts, floods, and stuff like that. Calamities, natural calamities, and most of it is attributed to climate change. In Kisii, Kisii is very green. It rains throughout the year, apart from during January and bits of February. Throughout the year, we have plenty of rain, so we do rain-fed agriculture, like we do farming. Sorry about the cuckoos. So yeah, yeah. So that's it. So what the mainstream media shows you is they basically looking for funds. They need money, and of course they trying to colonize us. It's like colonization never stopped in Africa, especially what the UN, the World Bank, and IMF is doing. Other than that, Kenya is a great country. The GDP per capita lies a lot because we have like a tiny percentage of the population who are very rich compared to the very poor. Like we have very many poor people, especially in the rural areas. Where I come from, people don't make 2,000 pounds or USD per year. They don't. Most people around here, especially small scale farmers, make around 700, 600 per year. If I wanted to do some savings, I'd save about 200 to 300 per year. That's on the extreme end. But now, because the life, like our expenditure has gone up because fertilizer has gone up, fuel has gone up, everything has gone up. People save even little. So that's it.
Just a few more questions on this. What do you grow? What does your farm produce?
Okay, personally, my family, we do tea. Tea is for commercial purposes. Like we sell tea to the tea buying centers and tea factories. They process the tea and sell to the UK and other countries, China, India, stuff like that. We also do avocados, we do bananas, we do maize especially, and beans, but maize especially because that's our staple food. We also do fruits like guavas, loquats. I don't know if you know what that is, among others. Oh, and finger millet.
You've described the environment you live in. On your, you have a Substack page, which we'll advertise in the notes of this interview, and obviously you're very active on Twitter as well. What comes across in that is the huge love and affection you have for your village and for the environment in which you live, and that comes across very strongly. So this is not something you're looking on as entirely bad. This is something that you have love for, but you recognise the need for development. And I was one of the comparisons in your part of the world. I saw in one of your other interviews you mentioned about 80% of the people were dependent on agriculture. The equivalent figure in Britain is 0.7%. So almost no one's involved in the agricultural sector in Britain, working in other things. And this has been a long process from the big transition was the Second World War, where people moved off the land and mechanisation took over. When you're looking at other aspects of the economy and how it affects the climate, fuel and energy is obviously a big part of that. What's the position regarding the cost of energy, the availability of energy? What sorts of fuels are you using, and where do you see there being chances for improvement and development in energy in Kenya?
That's like a good statistics, because in the US we have only 2% of the population doing agriculture or relying on agriculture for a livelihood. In Europe, generally, it's less than 5%. And in Africa, it's about 60 to 70%. In Kenya, around 80%. So that's a big, big number. And at the end of the day, you realize that we cannot feed ourselves. So that's a big problem. I think in sub-Saharan, so because the energy industry runs every other industry, agriculture, like if we want to improve agriculture, if we want to feed ourselves, if we want to beat poverty, we have to improve agriculture. We have to. That's our only way out for now. So how do we improve agriculture? By using fossil fuels, because farm mechanization, irrigation, and fertilizers, they all rely on fossil fuels in one way or the other. So back in 1800 in the US, we had about 83% of the population as farmers, 83%. In Japan, 90%. But today, you see the figure is so tiny. It's a small percentage. And that's thanks to farm tractors and stuff like that, like farm machinery. So a good example is a combine harvester. A combine harvester can replace, like a medium combine harvester can replace about 500 to 1,000 people. We do finger millet farming around here, and that requires a lot of labor. What a tractor, for instance, does, like, let's say I'm plowing a piece of land, 1 hectare, or for okay, let me use 1 hectare. So for 1 hectare, if I was using a 55 horsepower tractor to plow, that will take me like maybe at most 2 hours. But if I wanted to do to perform the same task using people, like manually using hose and stuff like that, I'd need about 80 people, and that's a lot of people. That's very many people. So for a tractor, it's 1 person driving the tractor, and it does the work efficiently, no tiring. For if you depend on manpower, it's quite expensive, and it's not efficient, and it's not quick. So we need lots of fossil fuels. Fertilizers are another good example. So we need lots of fertilizers, especially in Africa. Today, in Kenya, especially in Kenya, we use about 20 to 40 kilos of fertilizer per hectare per year annually. If you go to the US, it's 120. If you go to Europe, to the European nations, it's 150 kilos per hectare per year. And in China, it's 360 kilos per hectare per year. And that's a big, big number. I think that's why we're producing so little. And by the way, fertilizers, especially synthetic fertilizers, feed about 50 to 60% of the population, the total world population today. So people who say we don't need fossil fuels, I don't think they know what they are saying, and we don't have a replacement for that. So in the US, in 1920s, 1 hectare was producing 2 tons of corn or maize. Today they're producing 11 tons. In Kenya today, like in our farm, we produce around 3 tons. I know people who do 1 ton per hectare, and that's so little. That's why we cannot feed ourselves. So we need lots of fertilizers. And in throughout Kenya, because Kenya is mostly arid and semi-arid, about 80% is arid and semi-arid, ASAL. We need to find a way to irrigate our lands. I've seen the UN talk about Somalia, because Somalia is like a good example, and Somalia and Sudan, the two countries. For Somalia, it's so easy to feed people in Somalia. Like, we just need to find a way to. Um, so we have the Indian Ocean. We could get water from the Indian Ocean, desalinate it, and then irrigate land. How do we do that? In East Africa, we have plenty of fossil fuels. We need to tap that so that we can irrigate our lands. And we have a very big potential. I think about 75% of arable land left in the world is today in Africa. So we could feed the whole world. What we need is plenty of fossil fuels.
Just as a quick aside, you talked about the number of 80 man days it requires to prepare a hectare. In the pre-mechanized days in UK agriculture, that would have been done largely by either horse or ox power rather than manpower, and it would be about 2.5 days to prepare that amount. In fact, one of the old measurements of land area in Scotland was called the Ox Gang. It still crops up on old place names and things like this. And an ox gang was the area of land that one ox gang could plough in a day. And I think the definition of the acre is quite similar. Is animal power used in Kenya to any significant degree, or is it all human manpower?
So we have a few people, especially, but it depends with the region. So we have in the western region, people use the oxen. They use the oxen to plow land. But in other areas, especially now in Kisii, because we don't have huge land, we usually have about half an acre, or half a hectare. That's 1 acre of land. So because like a household has got 1 acre of land, uh, there is no need to own an oxen, because like you have to feed an oxen and you have to plant. You have to say take a third of that land and feed the oxen that are going to plow your land. So that wouldn't be efficient.
And what about other aspects of power generation? Is firewood still a main source, and what's the position with regards to access to electricity?
So in Kenya, we are very lucky. We have about 83% to 85%, I think, currently, of the population being connected to the grid. But at the end of the day, you realize that we use so little electricity. So a good example is my family. We use about 12 to 16 kilowatt hours a month. That translates to about 200 kilowatt hours a year. If you go to the US, people are using 13,000 kilowatt hours a year. We have access to electricity, but we don't have microwaves, we don't have fridges, we don't have laundry machines. So we usually are using our electricity to light our homes and maybe charge our phones, and maybe for the people who have got TV and radio, only that. So having access to electricity it's a good thing. It has brought a lot of change in our village, especially because you can see lights at night. That's a good thing. And it's even better for families that have these younger people in school, because now they don't use dirty kerosene stoves for lighting, or lamps for lighting. But we need to be rich first. Like, imagine, so we need another source of energy, and that's of course going to be fossil fuels, because that's how the West developed. There is no way we're going to run farm machinery using electricity. There is no way we're going to build using electricity. We have to use fossil fuels. Transportation, fossil fuels. Lots of stuff is fossil fuel. So yeah, we need access to energy. And talking about firewood, in my village, I'd say about 99%, 98% of the population in my village now cook using firewood. In other places, people use cow dung. They mix cow dung and charcoal waste, and then they dry it, and then they use that as a cooking source of energy. In sub-Saharan Africa now, in general, we have almost 90% of our total energy consumption coming from firewood. Like we're getting let me refer to that as biomass, not firewood, because biomass now is a general term. So we're getting almost 90% of our total energy consumption from burning biomass. And that's not a good thing, because that means that we cannot power industries or machines using firewood. Electricity, just a tiny consumption or percentage.
I was reading a little while ago about the impact the very positive impact that certain technologies have had in Africa. One that was described to me was the mobile phone. Maybe if you can confirm whether this is accurate or not. But the use of the mobile phone, because it didn't require the same built infrastructure as, say, Europe has with a hardwired landline phone system, that could be largely missed out. That put communication quickly all across rural Africa, where the infrastructure costs would have been prohibitive otherwise, and also picked up other benefits such as payment systems, secure payment systems in areas which were more exposed to theft and robbery and banditry. And this was an item that had kind of propelled forward commerce. Now, so firstly, I would ask: is that accurate? And could you also maybe outline some other technologies that have been particularly helpful to your part of Africa?
That's mostly accurate. One other technology I'd like to give a shout out to is motorcycles. In my village, even people who have gone to university and they lack employment, or they are not employed, because that's very common in Africa. Unemployment is very common. So people like that, they go and have access. They have access to a motorbike. Like you can get a motorbike at a very cheap price. So you're given like a motorbike at a very small fee, and then it's basically a loan. So you're going to pay for it at the end of the week or at the end of the month. And in 2 years' time, you have completed that. But that has transformed our economies in a very big way. Like if you came to my village, I know very many people, very many youths who are employed by the motorcycle industry. In Kenya today, I think about 2 million people. Out of the 54 million people, we have 2 million people employed by the motorcycle industry, and it's blooming. It has changed, because before the motorcycle industry exploded, back in 2020, like growing up generally, I was carrying Napier grass on my head growing up from age 10 upwards, I think, to about age 22. So I was carrying Napier grass on my head for 2 kilometers. We were harvesting maize about 2 kilometers away, and we had to carry that using on our heads. So that was a lot of work. Going to town, we had to walk. So carrying water, for instance, when we have a drought in January and Feb, we had to carry water on our head. So we have a few people now. More people can have access to the motorbikes, and they can use them to transport stuff. They have transformed our economies.
This is very interesting. I would like to kind of also just touch on some of the other aspects that we probably take for granted in places like the UK. One of them is the benefits of refrigeration, again, depending on electricity, and also the general preservation of food and avoiding waste. In the environment you're working in, is that a problem now? And if so, how do you get around the risk of food not being used but actually being wasted? if you don't have what we would have in the UK, which is a lot of refrigeration, a lot of plastic wrapping to keep things fresh, all of that type of sort of protection of food.
I think about 10% of your electricity consumption in the West, especially 10% of your electricity consumption goes to the refrigerator. And I'm just remembering one thing Alex Epstein usually says. So in the US, for instance, a person per capita, your refrigerator uses around 500 kilowatt hours per year. And as I said earlier, around here we use about 200 kilowatt hours per year. So your refrigerator uses more electricity compared to Jasper and like my whole family. It's crazy. So over here we have to cook, like you cook what you're going to eat, and like you don't we don't want to waste our food. So like if I wanted to cook for my family, I'm going to cook food for 6 people, and that's just it. Because the moment I cook more food, like if I have more milk, that's going to waste. So that's what happens around here. Especially, okay, so we have a few seasons when we have plenty of avocados, and most of them they end up rotting on the ground. Like we have plenty of avocados, or in particular seasons. So other times we have plenty of rain. So after 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 the drought, the January February drought, we usually people every person is planting vegetables, and now a month later everybody has got plenty of vegetables around. Most of that ends up rotting in our farms. And I recognize the impact of, say, a refrigerator. So in my village we have about I think less than 1% of my village people with access to a refrigerator, and that's just sad.
Yeah, it makes a big difference in a hot climate. It really does. You might be interested to know that we grow tea too in Scotland. It's very expensive, Scottish tea, but it can actually grow in our climate. So it's a remarkable plant, and obviously very popular in Britain. I'd like to move on now to your stance against the climate change orthodoxy and your move away from Greenpeace as it currently is configured. Patrick Moore, for example, you mentioned the former founder of Greenpeace. I've interviewed him, and he's also been in other pieces of work that are available on the UK Column website. So we're very familiar with his work, and he's very heartfelt addressing of the changes that have affected the environmental movement and how it's gone away from being in favour of preserving life and preserving the environment to this very destructive tendency where it's always seeking to stop and prevent and reduce and destroy in many regards. You've obviously seen this, and you've stood up against it. What sort of response have you got, first of all, in Kenya and in your local area to what you've been saying? Does this resonate with people?
So most people around here don't care about climate change. Most of the people in my village especially don't know what climate change is, because of course we have far bigger problems. And I'm pretty sure that's like very common in Kenya. Most people don't care about climate change. But they have heard about climate change because the West is like running our government. They are running our media. So media in Kenya, I guess that is happening throughout Africa. Media in Kenya are talking about, like, they have shows for climate change, environmental. Let's talk about climate change or the environment, and even in news that's happening. So recently there was the African Climate Summit. It happened in Kenya, and people have been talking about it. The other day I visited another big town in Kenya called Nakuru, and there was a big poster, a billboard talking about the African Climate Summit. So that has been happening, but people, of course, don't care about that because there are far bigger problems. People are worried about what they're going to eat at night and tomorrow, how they're going to school their kids, how they're going to beat poverty, how they're going to build houses. People want to develop. People don't care about climate change.
Yeah, so I was looking here. The Africa section of the United Nations is saying this about the situation. Climate change destroys the livelihoods of Kenyan pastoralists. Amid acute and persistent drought, pastoralists in northern Kenya, that's the arid part of the country, and other arid regions of Africa are in dire straits and hinge hope on potential compensation for loss and damage. So here we've got the UN pushing a very strange kind of dependency culture, not development, but receiving handouts from the West and some sort of victim mentality. Is that how you perceive it? I mean, how do you see the UN and Western influence in this, and how do you think it's affecting your society, your country?
So the northern part of Kenya has been experiencing drought and famine for very many years. There is a research, I think, by a PhD student in Nairobi University. I think the research is from, the paper was written in around 1880 or 1890. Sorry, 1990. So the paper talks about droughts happening because there are records. We had white people in Kenya back then in 1890s, 1900, the start of the 19th century, 18th century, I think. So anyway, back in 1890s and 1870s, 1880 and 1890, we had people in Turkana, the Turkana now, the people, the tribe now, the Turkana tribe, they were selling their kids to in exchange for food back in 1890s. So today, I don't think that's happening, but we have people dying, of course. And also, if you look at the statistics, the number of livestock in Turkana and in the northern part of Kenya has been going up, the number of livestock. So that means that the Turkana region is a bit better. It's doing far better. And they could do even more better with access to fossil fuels. So fossil fuels will help the Turkana people to drill boreholes or desalinate water because we have Lake Turkana up there. And like we have solutions. I don't know why the UN keeps on glorifying droughts and famines in Africa, but that, I guess, that's what makes them seem as saviors, the Jesus in Africa. In reality, these people, the UN actually is doing much more harm to us than the good. So the UN right now, the UN is preaching Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, whereby climate change is one of the uh, Sustainable Development Goals, and the rest, the 16 Sustainable Development Goals, they are all centered around climate change. So, like, if you want to beat poverty, how do we beat poverty? Keeping climate change at the middle, at the center of the conversation. So if you want to have more people educated, if you want to beat malnutrition, everything is just centered around climate change. But climate change is not, it's just a hoax. It's an excuse. The UN just wants us to keep on depending on them, on mostly the Western nations. I think the Western governments are very corrupt, and they don't want us to develop, because once we develop, it means that there's going to be a scramble for resources, especially fertilizer, because Africa's got, I think, about 90% in Morocco. Morocco has got about 90% of the phosphate rock in the world today. So they wouldn't want that. We have plenty of natural gas, we have plenty of oil, plenty of gas, plenty of coal, plenty of everything, plenty of gold, chromium, etc., etc. So they wouldn't want us to develop.
Yeah, so this is very critical because you mentioned colonization, but I think it's actually in many ways worse than that. One of the people we've interviewed in the past on the UK columns, a chap called Alistair MacLeod, uh, who is in the basically gold trading and banking services area, and he speaks on economic matters from a largely Austrian school perspective. He was born in Kenya at the tail end of the colonial period, and you speak to him about it, and it's very clear that he has extremely fond memories and a direct attachment with the place, and wishes it well. In the colonial era, you had people coming from Britain and farming and living and developing Kenya. I think what we've got now is actually much worse because you get people flying in, telling Kenyans not to develop, telling Kenyans to leave the resources in the ground, and flying out again. And they don't carry any responsibility. The responsibility for the poverty is then left with the Kenyans. There's no colonial power that's been looked on to say, well, you've got to do something about this country. You're managing it badly. Look at the people. No, there was at least some level, tenuous maybe, but of accountability. Now the UN flies in, the World Bank comes in with its economic development plans and its debt levels, and this doesn't seem to be in the best interest of the Kenyans. But the problems are all left at the door of the Kenyans. I think it's actually a worse system than colonialism, personally. The idea that the route of development and advancement that we've followed in the West, right, through various forms of power, coal, oil, and other forms, shouldn't be available to a country like Kenya seems to be bizarre. And like the way that the phone system it was rolled out in Africa, essentially straight to the mobile phone for a lot of Africa, and missed out the earlier technology, and leapt ahead or leapt to catch up, should be available to the countries in Africa without this strange constraint of this kind of anti-development, anti-growth mentality that seems to be being imposed upon you. What's the local political reaction? How does the government and the political leadership in Kenya respond to this? Do they see this as a threat? Do they say no, we want to develop, we want to get on, or are they influenced by the propaganda that comes out of the climate change belief system?
So the UN, World Bank, and IMF are some of the worst organizations to be in Africa today. And I think the WEF is gaining traction and it's climbing up the ladder. It's going to be at the top in a few years because people are listening to it, and the UN is like advertising it. So talking about the UN, back in 2005, the UN they had like a newspaper called, I think, something magazine. I can't remember the other name. So they wrote a piece titled "The Benefits of World Hunger," and like it was a lengthy piece talking about why world hunger is benefiting the West, especially because the author was asking, if everybody was rich as the West, who is going to mow our lawns? Who's going to mow our lawns? Who's going to clean our toilets? Who's going to do our kitchen gardens? So I wouldn't trust such an organization to have Africans in their best interest. Like, I wouldn't. Yeah. So World Bank and IMF recently, I think last month, they were cheering our government because, okay, so at first they told our government, we want to give you a loan, but you have to you have to do something about you being green, like the green policies, something related to the green policies. So our government said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to end fertilizer subsidies and fuel subsidies. So after the government did that, the UN and the World Bank and IMF was chairing the government, and then they gave now our government a loan. So in some way, our government is being pushed to the wall. Like, you have to uh, push the green policies to your people, otherwise we won't help you. And we don't have much we don't have that many options. Our options are limited. So I think one of the the president of Kenya, William Ruto, I like him, but because, like, he's very educated, but I also dislike him, or hate him, because he glorifies climate change. Like, he's talking about climate change, he's being invited to big climate summits happening in France or the US. In Like, we had the African Climate Summit in Kenya. Imagine that, not any other country in Africa but Kenya. So he's like at the top in Africa. I think he's one of the number one presidents talking about climate change, or thinking that climate change is a problem in Africa. I think he's getting good money for pushing the climate narrative to us and to other African countries. So yeah, I don't like that.
Yes, yes. We don't trust the World Bank and the IMF either. They're not good news from any part of the globe. The anti-development line in the West is playing out somewhat differently. It's been used to destroy industries. We've got politicians posing and smiling in front of the press as they demolish power stations and close down productive parts of the economy. It's a horrible sight to behold, and they suggest that they're being so virtuous by doing this, and the core problem of the need for affordable energy as being one of the core drivers of the economy, and in a cold northern climate like Britain, of life, because it's the winter season it's the threat to life here. It's not heat, it's cold that tends to cause much higher death rates. And we're seeing this constant push against development. And then we're given some sorts of technologies which get the stamp of approval. One of them is obviously electric battery vehicles. Now, we're aware that some of the conditions in African mines with child labour that is generating the lithium and the other rare metals for the batteries, cobalt and such things, are pretty horrendous. And if you look at the environmental impact of this technology, it's by no means clear that it's an improvement on the current level of technology with fossil fuels. By no means clear. This is all based on the CO2 is a killer. The CO2 is causing runaway warming myth. This is the driver for everything, and this is the mantra that cannot be challenged. In politics, certainly in Britain, there's no one really pushing against this. You talked about the influence of the World Bank and the IMF, which is certainly toxic. In terms of the economy and banking and money in Kenya, do you have a local banking infrastructure, a local what is the local currency? How stable is all of that? And is there an alternative locally to depending wholly on this centrally controlled, top-down, supranational body investment? Can you attract inward investment from private sources, and can you generate savings and investment within Kenya?
Let me talk about heat-related and cold-related deaths. As you said, even in Africa, because we are around the equator, the tropical regions. So even in Africa, we have we have 1.2 million people dying annually from extreme cold compared to 26,000 people dying from extreme heat. That's a big difference. So yeah, heat is not the problem. Cold is, and I don't know why people keep on talking about, oh, the world is like heating up. I don't see any bad with the world heating up, because even crops want they do better in a warm environment. A good example is comparing Molo in the Rift Valley and in Kisii, where we live currently. So in Molo, we when we plant maize, uh, after we harvest the maize after 9 to 10 months. In Kisii, we usually harvest maize after 6 months, around 6 months, because the place is warm. So yeah, heat is not bad, cold is. Talking about our banks, so we have the Kenyan shilling as our uh, currency, national currency. But today we have people trying to invest in USD, like they want to deal with USD, the United States dollar, because it's not as volatile as the Kenyan shilling. Today, uh, like the dollar is stable. So we have local banks around. We have Kenyan Commercial Bank, Equity. We have even, there is one from the US. We have Stanbic. There is another one from the UK. I can't remember the name, but we have um, local banks around. If somebody wanted to invest in Kenya, they could comfortably. Actually, you just have to have the right papers and know the right people. You would want to do everything in a professional way. Like, you wouldn't want to pass through the shortcuts, because at the end of the day, they're going to bite you. So yeah, one could invest in Kenya comfortably.
And is there much inward investment? Are you seeing that having a positive effect, or is it quite rare?
It depends with the type of investment. So we have people from India. We have Indians in Kenya who have invested so much in horticulture. They're growing, especially roses, and cutting the flowers and exporting European to the European market, the UK, Germany, Belgium, stuff like that. At the end of the day, you realize that, okay, people benefit from working those greenhouses, but the benefits, because I've interned in one of the farms, I wouldn't refer to that as helping us, because at the end of the day, like, if you're working in a greenhouse, it's very hot, and we have, like, they apply lots of chemicals to grow those flowers. Everything, like, every day they fertilize uh, the flowers every day, the roses every day, and that means there's plenty of chemicals. So they have to spray pesticides. I think in after every 3 days, fungicides maybe after every 3 days. At the end of the day, that's not. And the people working in those greenhouses, let's say spraying the chemicals, don't have protective gear. That's not good for their health. And these people, some of them are very racist, I'd say. Like, they hate Africans, so they don't treat us as equals. They just here for money. Like, if they're making good money out of it, that's just it. They might be generating like 1 billion Kenyan shillings a day. That's about 10,000, 100,000. That's about 10. It's a lot of money. So let's say they're making like 1 million a day. 1 million a day, that's about 10,000 USD, or maybe 7,000 pounds a day. At the end of the day, uh, using even 1% of that money, they want it to be 0.5. They want it to be even less. Like, they want all the profits for themselves. But we have a few other people who are nice. Like, they have done investment in Kenya and they treat us as equals. But that's like a tiny percent. People are out here and they all about business. How much are we making? The capitalism the capitalist way.
Yes. The inward, there can be problems with inward investment, but the idea that there's a potential industry for growing agricultural produce, and you mentioned flowers there, exporting it to Europe is obviously a potential for international division of labour and a means of developing Kenyan industry and commerce. Now, that also is going to be under attack because the transport infrastructure is under attack by the global warming agenda. It's looking to essentially end by 2050 all sea transport that's based on fossil fuels. And this is going to make sea transport much more expensive. And it's going to mean that crops that have to go quickly to market, perhaps by air, they may not be able to make it to the market at all. And this will undermine that development and undermine that investment. And this is another area where the central planning is pushing down on countries that are trying to develop. And this seems to me to be the very opposite of what we should be doing. It's certainly the case that some of the working conditions in an early point in an industrial development will be very poor. These tend to improve as the economy develops because there's competition for staff and competition for workers, and this drives up the standards enormously, and holding that back means that the exploitation, the poor working conditions, they tend to persist longer, I think, than they would otherwise do, which is very worrying. Jusper, we've covered a huge amount of ground. I want to thank you very much for your time today. It's been fascinating listening to you. Would you like to close off with a few final thoughts on what you would like to see happening to your community, and what interference that's coming in to Kenya you would like to see cease?
I would want my government, be it Kenya, be it throughout Africa, because we are one nation. So I would want the UN, the World Bank, the IMF to stop the neocolonialism that they're running in Africa in the name of degrowth, or actually they using climate change as a scapegoat, but in reality they all talking about degrowth or depopulation. And of course it's going to start from Africa, because they are saying too much of them, just about enough of us. That's their mantra. So anyway, I would want those organizations to leave Africa alone. Like, we're going to develop eventually because we are chasing to beat poverty. We want to beat hunger. We want to be educated. We want to beat unemployment. We want to improve agriculture. We want to have industries. We don't want to sell raw goods. We want to add value to our goods before exporting, because as you said, the exports market has got, like, it pays very well, up to 5 times compared to selling produce locally. I would want my government, especially my president, to leave alone climate change, because that's not a problem to Kenyans. He should ask around. People don't care about climate change. They want to live a better life. They want their life standards improved. We need lots of energy because we're consuming so little fossil fuels. 1.4 billion people consuming 3.9 to 4 million barrels of oil per day, compared to 20 million barrels of oil per day in the US by 330 million people. And those people are telling us that we need to stop using fossil fuels. we actually don't even use fossil fuels. We barely use fossil fuels, and we have plenty of that. Solar and wind isn't going to do it. It's unreliable, intermittent, parasitic, and it's mostly electricity. We don't need much electricity. And we have hydro, we have geothermal, and we have plenty of fossil fuels. So we don't even need a loan from the Western nations. We just want investors in Africa. We want the investors to invest in drilling oil, tapping natural gas, getting coal, extracting coal, and we're going to pay you back. Of course, it's a very expensive commodity, and once you invest in Africa in oil, gas, and coal, you're going to get your money back. Unlike us relying on solar and wind, which is basically us getting a loan from World Bank or the UN, the World Bank and the IMF, and eventually you realize that it's a debt trap. So fossil fuels for Africa.
Jusper, thank you very much. Fossil fuels for Africa, and it's nice to finish on a point where the view from Chile, Scotland, and the view from equatorial East Africa both say the same thing, which is leave us alone. Jusper, until next time, thank you very much.